Welcome back. We are moving on to constitutional experiments. So, what happens after independence? Leaders in both the US and in Latin America espoused constitutionalism. In the United States, the colonists' prior experience with representative government contributed to the success of constitutionalism. In Latin America, inexperience with popular politics contributed to the failure of constitutions. And if you guys remember from Revolutions in the Americas podcast, I did talk about how the colonists practice with small local governments and some economic and political autonomy did allow them to be a bit more successful when setting up the first American government. In Latin American countries that were run by the Spanish, they were not allowed to do this. Obviously, Brazil was not allowed to do this either. In Latin America, lack of experience with elected legislatures and municipal governments led to the drafters of constitutions to experiment with untested and impractical political institutions. Latin American nations also found it difficult to define the political role of the church and to subordinate the army and its prestigious leaders in a civilian government. Now, let's change gears a little bit and flip over and talk about Canada. Many in British North America after 1830 saw themselves as both Canadian and British. After the American War for Independence, the British government was worried about other colonies. Canadians began to demand more autonomy after 1830. They wanted responsible government in which they elected a government, including a prime minister. Meanwhile, in Britain during the 1840s, there were internal reforms. French Canadians were willing to wait for reform as well. In Canada, Britain responded to demands for political reform and even a rebellion in 1837 by establishing limited self-rule in each of the provinces in the 1840s. In 1867, the British Parliament passed the British North America Act. The provisional governments of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia entered into a confederation to form the Dominion or Confederation of Canada, with a central government in Ottawa. Between 1867 and 1884, the Canadian Pacific Railway was built. The railroad and industrialization transformed the Great Plains. The Canadian government remained stable throughout the 19th century. Moving along. All right. So take a look. Northwest Territories. Some important places to know. Also, if we go back here, you can see the different territories and now the different provinces. Within Mexico, you can see newly acquired territory. Some of it purchased, some of it not exactly purchased, taken, stolen. But we also have different railroads, rail systems, so major roads, what will eventually become Oregon Territory, and then the state of Oregon, Oregon Trail, starting in Independence, Missouri. Fun. All right. Talking about personalist leaders. Successful military leaders in both the US and in Latin America were able to use their military reputations as the foundations of political power. George Washington stood out for his willingness to relinquish and transfer power voluntarily and without violence. Let's also keep in mind he didn't want the job in the first place. So that might have played into the willingness to relinquish power. These new republics also saw the rise of populist leaders who articulated the desires of the excluded poor and who at times used populist politics to undermine constitutional order and move towards dictatorship. Andrew Jackson in the United States and Jose Paez in Venezuela are two examples of populist politicians who challenged the constitutional limits of their authority. Paez declared Venezuela's independence from Bolivar's Gran Colombia in 1829 and ruled as president, or dictator, for the next 18 years. Jackson was born in humble circumstances. He was a successful general and as president increased the powers of the presidency at the expense of Congress and Supreme Court. Personalist leaders like Paez and Jackson dominated national politics by identifying with common people, but in practice, they promoted the interests of powerful property owners. Personalist leaders were common in both the US and Latin America, but in Latin America, the weaker constitutional tradition, less protection of property rights, lower literacy levels, and less developed communication systems allowed personalist leaders to become dictators. After independence, the relatively weak central governments of the new nations were often unable to prevent regional elites from leading secessionist movements, often driven by the issue of slavery. In Spanish America, all of the post independence efforts to create large multi state federations failed. Central America split off from Mexico in 1823 and then broke up into 5 separate nations. Gran Colombia broke up into Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador, and Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia declared their independence from Argentina. Regionalism threatened the United States when the issue of slavery divided the nation, leading to the establishment of the Confederacy and the U.S. Civil War. 11 southern states declared their independence. Created by the Confederation States of America, the Civil War was unequal in terms of resources. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. And after the war, federal troops occupied the South to make sure that federal law, including emancipation, was implemented, and this was known as the Reconstruction period. Reconstruction ended with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency in 1876. The power of the federal government was increased by the Civil War. Compared to the breakaway states in Latin America, the Confederacy failed in part because of very poor timing. The new states of the Western Hemisphere were most vulnerable during the first decades after independence. The Confederacy's attempt to secede from the U.S. came when the national government was well established and strengthened by experience, economic growth, and population growth. All right, there's a lot of information that we're going to be going over here. We're talking about foreign interventions and regional wars. During the 19th century, wars between Western Hemisphere nations and invasions from the European powers often determined national borders, access to natural resources, and control of markets. By the end of the 19th century, the US, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile had successfully waged wars against their neighbors and established themselves as regional powers. European military intervention included the British attack on the United States in the War of 1812, the US's war with Spain in 1898 to 1899, French and English naval blockades of Argentina, an English naval blockade of Brazil, and Spanish and French invasions of Mexico. And I did put all of that up there. You might want to write this down. There also will be postings on the classroom, readings about these various conflicts. And yes, there are a lot of them, I know. After gaining its independence from Spain in 1814, Mexico's government became very conservative. One of the first crises of independent Mexico was over the territory of Texas. The United States and Mexico went to war over the U.S. idea of manifest destiny. Thank you, President James Polk. The U.S. defeated Mexico and forced the Mexican government to give up Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. In 1848, Mexico lost even more land to the U.S. Benito Juarez saw these losses as a need for liberal reforms. In 1855, President Santa Anna was removed from office by a coup of conservatives. In 1861, Emperor Napoleon III sent troops to invade Mexico. And when the French invaded Mexico in 1862, they ousted President Benito Juarez and established Maximilian Habsburg as emperor. Juarez drove the French out in 1867, so 5 years later. And when this happened, Maximilian was captured and executed by firing squad. His wife, Carlotta, ended up losing her mind after Maximilian's execution. It was a love match, and she was completely heartbroken at his execution. Maximilian wasn't necessarily a bad guy, but advised and made very poor decisions by the wrong people, and really is used as a pawn. But That being said, he does have his own mind and he could have made better decisions, but obviously he did not. And the fact is, you have a French force invading an independent nation. Once he is executed, Carlotta is sent back to Europe. Unfortunately, she never recovers from this and spends the rest of her days living in a respite home, asking where her husband was. So, kind of a sad outcome there. A compromise between liberals and conservatives was achieved with the rule of Porfirio Diaz in 1876. Chile defeated the combined forces of Peru and Bolivia in 2 wars, 1836 to 39 and 1879 to 83. Chile gained nitrate mines and forced Bolivia to give up its only outlet to the sea. Argentina and Brazil fought over control of Uruguay in the 1820s, but finally recognized Uruguayan independence. Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay then cooperated in a 5-year war against Paraguay, in which Paraguay was defeated, occupied, and then lost territory, and finally was forced to open up its market to foreign trade. When the former colonies of the Western Hemisphere became independent, the colonial powers ceased to play a role as mediator for and protector of the native peoples. Independent Amerindian peoples posed a significant challenge to the new nations of the Western Hemisphere, but Amerindian military resistance was mostly overcome in both North and South America by the end of the 1880s. In the U.S., rapid expansion of white settlement between 1790 and 1810 led to conflict between the forces of the American government and Amerindian confederations. Further white settlement led to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced the resettlement of Eastern Amerindian peoples to lands west of the Mississippi River. Jackson enforced an Indian Removal Act passed by Congress, and Amerindians on the Great Plains, who had become skilled users of horses and firearms, became a formidable resistance to the expansion of white settlement. Horses and firearms also made the Plains people less reliant on agriculture and more reliant on buffalo hunting. But the near extinction of the buffalo, loss of land to ranchers, and nearly 4 decades of armed conflict with the United States Army forced the Plains Amerindians to give up their land and accept reservation life. Sioux leaders like Sitting Bull believed that U.S. treaties could not be trusted. In the 1870s, railroads brought more settlers into the Dakota Territory. Some Plain Amerindians joined the Ghost Dance movement, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs began a policy of cultural genocide. And we will talk more about that in class. We'll be discussing the schools that were set up and how Native American parents were forced to give up their children or just had their children taken away from them and sent off to these schools to learn European American culture. In Argentina and Chile, native people were able to check the expansion of white settlement until the 1860s, when population increase, political stability, and military modernization gave the Chilean and Argentinian governments the upper hand. In the 1870s, the governments of both Argentina and Chile crushed native resistance and drove surviving Amerindians into marginal land. In Mexico, independence in 1821 did not immediately change the daily lives of native peoples. Plantation owners in the Yucatan Peninsula had forced Maya communities off their land and into poverty. Commercial agriculture transformed the Yucatan in the 1840s. In 1847, when the Mexican government was busy with its war against the U.S., the Maya communities in the Yucatan rose in a revolt, and this is called the Caste War, that nearly returned the Yucatan to Mayan rule. Mayan militants used division in the Mexican government to reclaim their independence in the Yucatan Rebellion. Scattered fighting in the Yucatan continued until 1895. In Canada, the Métis rebellions were uprisings of mixed-race and First Nations people in Canada. Louis Riel, leader of the Métis, led a resistance to incorporation. The Indian Act of 1876 established Canadian government control over the First Nations, and in 1885, Louis Riel led a second Métis rebellion. The abolition of slavery. is where we're going to wrap up for today. There'll be one more podcast in this series. If you have any questions, please send me an email. Tomorrow we'll pick up abolition of slavery and then moving on to women's rights and the struggle for social justice. Have a great day, guys. Cheers.